Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Louis' Garage. This time we are going to be doing some actual work on the Lotus Exige S. So like I said in the previous episode, I got this car back home. It drove 1,000 kilometers without too much of an issue at all, and it was really nice to drive. Everything worked well. But this is one of the reasons why when you get a new car you should really go through everything, make sure it's all okay, make sure everything is done up tight, you don't have any loose bolts, and you don't have any maintenance that you should be doing, because there are some things on cars that you can catch pretty early and it doesn't cause you as much of a headache as if you caught it much later on. And today is an example of that. So if we have a look down here, I've jacked up the car and I've taken the wheel off at the back here, and have a look at this goo or gunk that is building up around the wheel well area. So what that is a split CV boot. So you can see down here there's a little split just in there. I don't know if you can see it, but trust me, there's a split there, and it's just flinging all that CV grease all over the place, all over the car, and eventually that CV grease is all going to come out of the CV boot, and then your CV joint is just going to go dry, and that's when you need to start replacing expensive components like your drive shafts. So what we'll be doing today is we'll be replacing the CV boots, and I'll be using a really high quality Redline CV grease as well, just to make sure that everything lasts a lot longer as well. And so the first step, like I said, is to jack up the car. The jacking points are pretty obvious. There's one on the side there, and then one on the other side as well. And then you just have to remove the under tray and the diffuser. I think you probably just only need to remove the under tray for this, but I've just removed the diffuser so that I can have a really good look underneath to make sure everything's okay. And yeah, basically we'll just have to undo this hub nut. I've already taken out this pin, so it uses a pin to retain the hub nut, so the hub nut doesn't come loose. You just have to pull this out using a pair of pliers, and then we can get to the hub nut. So for this particular car, it's actually a 30mm hub nut, and I had to buy a special impact socket, a 30mm impact socket, just to be able to undo this hub nut. But I've heard rumors that some of these hub nuts are 32mm, so you probably best to measure the hub nut before you actually start buying these tools, and just make sure that you've got the right size tool for the hub nut. So I'm just going to try and use my impact gun at first. It's not a very powerful one, but I think it's going to help to loosen up the bolt a little bit, and then probably make it a little bit easier for us to remove in the process. So let's just do that. So there we go, there's my 30mm socket. Oh, it worked! Yeah, it worked! Amazing! See, you don't need a big $500 impact wrench. Just get one from Bunnings. Alright, so step one is going to be try and get rid of all this grease. You can see that over there, it's pretty much everywhere, so use some gloves because CV grease is very messy. You don't really want to get it all over your hands, so I'm just going to use some paper towels and just wipe this up, and hopefully that's going to get it clean enough so that we can actually start working around this area, because otherwise all the tools and everything else that you use is all going to get CV grease everywhere. So just give it a good clean, and then we'll sort it out after that. Right, so here we are looking from the back of the car, and as you can see there's a bit of a split there in the CV boot. That's where all the CV grease is coming out from. So I've heard that it's usually not because the CV boot itself has any problems, but sometimes it's because it gets quite hot, especially on this side of the car, because this is where the exhaust actually exits out. So it could potentially heat up the CV boot, and that could actually cause the CV boot to fail prematurely. So that's why people recommend that you get the Tuff Boots from BOE, and that's what I've got from the US. And they also recommend a Redline CV2 CV grease, and I'll be showing you those products soon. But right now what we're trying to do is basically just get rid of these two bolts, or undo these two bolts up here. Those two, they are 8mm Allen head bolts or hex bolts. so we should be able to get rid of those pretty quick, and then the whole upper wishbone will be disconnected, and that means we can then take the hub off the axle, and therefore start getting the drive shaft or the axle out of the car. Right, so there you go, that's my little setup there. I've got my Allen head, 8mm Allen head on my ratchet, and all I need to do, I've already loosened it up a little bit. It wasn't very tight actually, which is good, and I just need to keep loosening it up until the bolt comes out. And we just have to do the same for the other one as well. Alright, I've got my ratchet set up for the next bolt, and I had to put an extension on it because the coilover, I had to put an extension on it because the shocks and the spring, I had to put an extension on it because the shock and the spring are in the way. So I'm just hanging out all the way over here, and I'm just going to undo this nut over here as well. There you have it. Not too hard at all, huh? So just got to undo that, and then should be able to swing the hub away from the drive shaft, and then somehow pull the drive shaft off. Alright, just when you're pulling the bolt out, you're going to probably find a whole bunch of spaces just in here. And we think that's probably because these are to adjust the camber on your car. So just be careful with those, don't lose them. We've just put them in with the bolts so that we don't lose them and they don't go anywhere. So just watch out for that as well. Alright, we're going to take the hub nut off, and then hopefully, because it's completely separated now, we should just swing down and come out of the way. Do you want a video? Hub nut off. Definitely not as easy as I thought it was going to be. Alright everyone, a bit of a sit rep here. So we're having a lot of trouble trying to get this hub all the way off the drive shaft, especially because the thread here is quite long. So we had a look online, and a lot of people are recommending that we take off the caliper here. And that will also allow us to get access to the toe link bolt, which is just down there, and then we can undo that, remove the toe link there, and that should give us enough room to swing the hub this way, and that'll get it off the axle. So hopefully we can do that. I think removing the caliper is pretty straightforward. It's just this bolt here, it's a 17mm back here, and then there's another hex bolt just down there as well, and then we just need to support it so that it's not dangling from the brake line. Alright, so we are having to remove this bolt as well to get the caliper off. So that means you want to put a spanner on this and rotate this so that it basically pulls the handbrake, and then the handbrake line should come free once you release the tension from the line. So you just got to pull it through this little gap here. There's a little gap right there. And then after that, you can actually just pull the handbrake line all the way off, and that'll give us access to the bolt in there. Alright, so we finally got this ball joint off without damaging anything, and the way we did it was just using a big sledgehammer on the side of the hub there. So you just hit this point, and then George put some pressure on the top over here, just using the back of another hammer. So put pressure down on the ball joint and hit it at the same time, and hopefully it'll just pop open and pop free. So now we should be able to get the hub off the axle and carry on with this job.
Such a glorious moment, eh?
Oh, I'm waiting for it. Oh, finally! Woo! High five. Alright, so the next step of getting these drive shafts out is going to be draining the gearbox fluid. So you can see the drain plug here. So this is a 24mm plug. So we'll be loosening that up to drain the fluid. And then you can see the fill plug just up here as well. So best thing to do is to actually undo the fill plug so that you can be sure that you can put the fluid back in. You can see I've loosened it up already. It's a 17mm plug, and then that means that you can fill up the fluid. It's also a good idea just to loosen it a little bit so that it allows the fluid to drain a little bit faster when you are draining the gearbox fluid. Alright, so I've just loosened mine up using my spanner. I don't have a 24 socket, so I've just used a spanner. There's not much room back here anyway, so I think using a spanner is fine. So you can see this just comes loose. And then you should just be able to undo this and drain the fluid out. Now I have ordered some new fluid as well, which is MT90. I've decided to use Redline MT90. Apparently that's much better than stock. And that should help with the gear shifting and the cold start performance in the gearbox as well. Alright, so we're just under the drive shaft, and the next step is to take off these two bolts that are holding the drive shaft and the bracket all together and securing it onto the car. So there's two bolts, there's two 14mm bolts there, so that one and that one. Right, so once you've removed those two bolts, you just need to have a little screwdriver and pry the two sides of this bracket apart, and that should free up the bracket a little bit because it will be a little bit rusty like my one is in there. And then once you get that loose, you should be able to just pull the whole drive shaft out. Alright everyone, so on the left hand side drive shaft, we're just trying to get that out. So what happens is there's a little circlip right inside the drive shaft that holds the drive shaft into the gearbox. So what we've got is we've just got a big screwdriver and a big hammer, and we're literally just putting the screwdriver in that little groove and hitting it with the hammer just so that it shocks the circlip and actually comes out. So we should be able to get it out that way. Oh, there we go. Awesome. Alright, well that's one drive shaft removed. There we go, there's the little circlip, and so you do have to turn it so that it hangs in the right place. Sometimes it's in the wrong orientation, so then you can hit it with the screwdriver or with a pry bar on this lip here, and that will get it out of the gearbox. Alright, so here's our drive shaft out of the car. This side is actually fine, the CV boots are okay, but we're just going to change them at the same time anyway to these BOE Tuff Boots. So you can see the BOE Tuff Boots are quite different in design, so they have less, less like these flappy bits compared to the OEM CV boot, and also you can tell that they're a bit thicker because if you press on it like this, it's really hard to press these in, whereas if you press on the OEM boot, it's actually a little bit easier to press them in like that. So they definitely seem a little bit better quality. We're also going to be using different CV grease as well, as recommended by BOE. So we're going to be using the Redline CV2 grease, and I'll be able to show you that soon as well. Alright, so you're going to have to take these clamps off the drive shaft, and we didn't really find any way of doing it elegantly, so we ended up just kind of getting a screwdriver under the middle bit here where it's thin, and then just prying it off and just kind of forcing it out. So you're going to have to remove all of these clamps so we can fit the new CV boots on. Right, so what we're actually doing is we're going to be splitting this CV joint and this housing for the drive shaft, and then we're going to pull that out, and then everything is going to come out from this inner CV joint here. So that's the right way to do it apparently. I think there's a couple of circlips in there that we need to undo, so we'll need to have a look into that as well. So you can see all that old CV grease in there. We'll be replacing that with the Redline CV2. Yes, you do get really messy when you do this. It's not a very tidy job, But yeah, make sure you have gloves, make sure you have cardboard and lots of paper towels. We've got some petrol and degreaser so that we can get rid of the old stuff as well. Alright, so if you're wondering how to separate this CV joint and get the boots off and everything, what you have to do is, you see there's a little clip here. Once you clean up all the CV grease and everything, you'll see this little clip that goes on the outside, and this is retaining the whole joint inside the housing so that it doesn't just all pull out. So what you have to do is take a really small screwdriver and just poke it into this little hole, and then you can actually just pry the clip out, and that allows you to hopefully remove the whole joint from the housing. We did it so well last time.
Yeah.
There we go. So the other thing is, I think I've already mentioned, but let's just mention it again, that everything is done on the inner joint. So this is the outer joint, that's where the wheel and the hub and everything goes, and then this is the inside where it connects to the gearbox. So everything has to be done on the inner joint. Don't try and take apart the outer one, and this is the whole reason why we have to take the axle out in order to remove the CV boots. So just make sure that you're working on the right side of the drive shafts. Okay, so there should be a circlip in here. You can just see that circlip coming through now, and that allows us to pull off. What's this bit called? I can't remember the technical name for it.
It's the piece that holds the bearings.
Yeah, whatever it's called, the piece that holds the bearings. And then once we get that off, that means we can then slide both of the CV boots out.
Off the inside.
Yeah, from there, and then install the new CV boots.
Take it this side. You can just see the circlip over there.
Yep, you can just see it now. Yeah, so we're going to be getting rid of that. We've got some circuit pliers, so that'll help you with this job as well, having some circuit pliers. Alright, so to get this bit off, what we're doing is we're just using a piece of wood, and we're just hitting it with a hammer, and that's actually just prying it off. So it's actually pretty easy. It's not really stuck on there at all. So don't use too much force. Use a piece of wood so you don't damage anything, and then you should be able to just knock that out. Okay, so for the outboard CV joint, it's also you can hit off the joint, and the way that we did it, because we don't really have like a slide hammer or anything like that,
or a vise,
or a proper vise, whoops, is that we just basically cable tied a block of wood onto the drive shaft, and we held it up against the splines that you can see there. Yep, the splines there, we held it up against there, and we basically just twisted the CV joint so that the spline is really pronounced, and it's showing on the outside, and then we just used a pretty big 4-pound hammer just to hit it out, you know, on the piece of wood, so that we didn't damage anything in there, and it actually worked really well. So yeah, that's probably the right-ish technique to use if you are doing this at home. Alright, so a couple of days later we have a grease gun. We actually bought the wrong size grease gun initially, because the CV2 grease is a 14 ounce or 400 gram or close to 400 gram container, whereas we bought one for the 450 gram containers, so we have to get a new grease gun. Look at that, it's pretty nice and shiny.
Shrinkflation, eh?
And then we're just busy packing the bearings with all the grease, and basically just trying to get as much grease into this one as possible, because we didn't actually take all the bearings out for this one. This is the outer CV joint. Yeah, once we get enough grease in there, we should be able to push it onto the drive shaft, and then put the boot over it. So it's not too difficult to just make sure that you pack enough grease in there, make sure the grease is clean. You know, you don't want any dirt or anything in there at all, and then it's just a matter of putting it all back together. Alright, so we've done one side of our drive shaft. We've got the clamps on, and just a couple of tips for you guys, which I'll show you soon as well on the other side. So we had a real struggle getting these clamps on the Tuff boot. So what we ended up doing was actually pulling the boot off and then putting the clamp around in the right area, all locked in, not squeezed in obviously, but just locked into the tabs. And then we pushed everything together onto the housing. So if you're struggling with the clamp, that's one way to do it. The other tip that I've got for you as well is to buy one of these clamp tools, clamp pliers, just to squeeze the clamp. It makes it a lot easier. I was using some other tools before and it kind of worked, but it didn't really work properly, so this is definitely the right tool to get. Just got this one off eBay for, you know, 10 or 20 bucks. And then finally, the other tip is to release air pressure in your CV boot, because when you push it in and when you push it around, all that sort of stuff, chances are you're going to have some positive pressure in there, and if you leave it in there, that could actually potentially blow your boot out when you're driving around, and if the grease heats
because
up,
it gets hot and heats the hair up.
Because it gets hot and then the air expands. So you'll want to get like a little screwdriver in there and just release whatever pressure is in there, whether it's negative or positive pressure. Just make sure that it's neutral pressure before you clamp everything up. Cool, so we're going to do this side now. This one's the one with the circlip and the ball bearings that we were able to get out. So yeah, we'll show you how to put that all back together as well, and put some grease in there. Alright guys, it's a bit of a mess, but here's a bit of an update. So this side, on the driver's side for us, on the right hand side of the car, it was really hard to separate the two sides of the drive shaft. And on the passenger side, it was really easy. We literally just pulled it apart after pulling off the little clip. And it was really easy to pull the bearings out. But on the driver's side, it was really, really difficult. And we had to use quite a bit of force. And as we were pulling it out, we noticed that there may be a reason for that. And so if you have a look inside this bearing carrier, you'll see that there's a little crack. Well, when I say little, it was quite big when it was actually on the spline. But here, when it's off the spline, it looks a little bit smaller. But there's a big crack all the way through the bearing carrier. And this car, the Exige, it was crashed on track before, and this is the side that they hit as well. The wheel was hit, the suspension was hit, so it does kind of make sense that there's a little bit of damage in here. But it just kind of goes to show that a lot of the time you just cannot rely on other people fixing up these cars or saying that they're repaired properly. You really do have to dig into all these little pieces in the car to figure out what's going on. Now luckily the boot over there actually had a split, so that's why we're doing this job in the first place, is to replace the boot. But we noticed the crack in here, and so that's definitely going to have to be replaced. And there's quite a bit of play on this side as well, actually. There's quite a bit of play there on the CV joint there. So I think what will happen is we're just going to replace the whole drive shaft, because they are just standard Toyota drive shafts. But I think we'll probably replace the boots with the Tuff Boots now that we've got the Tuff Boots anyway. But it just means that it's just going to take a little bit more time, and we're going to need a few more parts. So yeah, bit of a lesson for all of us. Definitely don't take cars out on track that you don't know really the history of or how it's been repaired. I'm lucky that I haven't taken the Exige out on track yet, because this could have failed. This whole CV joint could have failed, and that would have left me stranded at worst. Stranded at best, and at worst it could have caused another accident as well. I could have easily come off the track and hit the car again. So it's really imperative that we take our time, and we look at everything closely, and drive the car around properly, make sure there's no weak points in the car. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to sort this out soon, and then I can get the car back on the road. But yeah, that's pretty crazy. I mean, this is a big piece of metal, and it must have had a lot of impact to crack it all the way through like that. Must have been a pretty big hit. Alright guys, so the drama with the drive shaft continues. We've done a little bit of research, and I'm hoping that this video actually saves people a lot of headaches, a lot of time, and a lot of money as well, potentially in the future. So what happened was, as I said before, this drive shaft seems to be pretty bad. It's in pretty bad condition. You can see just from the play that it has here, and the fact that it's really, really stiff. When you try and push it beyond that little bit of play, is not normal. So we haven't opened up this end yet, the outer part of the drive shaft, or the outer CV, but it seems like it's got the same issue that we had on the inner. So I'm thinking maybe there's even some cracks and stuff in there as well, which is not ideal. So instead of buying a Lotus part, what I thought was, because it's running as a drivetrain from the 2ZZ or the Silica, some Corollas come with this engine as well, so I think it's probably a good idea just to buy a second-hand one from one of those cars just to compare and see exactly what the differences are. And from the photos, I noticed that the outside CV, this one here, definitely different from the Toyota one, which you can see from here. So the Toyota one has an ABS ring, it's got different splines, it's got different thread, and even the actual CV joint housing, the diameter and everything is totally different. But that's okay, you know, we can actually buy an outer CV joint pretty cheap. There's aftermarket parts available, you don't have to buy an original Lotus part as well. And obviously, if you can get the rest of the drive shaft without spending too much money, then it's a big win. Because for a Lotus one, I think it's around about $1,000 NZ, you know, something like that. And that's excluding shipping and, you know, taxes and all that sort of stuff. So it's quite a bit of money actually to spend on just something that you can get pretty cheaply. So I picked this one up locally. This is second hand, but it's actually in pretty good condition. And I managed to pick this one up for $95, and there was $10 of shipping on that as well, because we're currently in lockdown, so I can't go pick up anything. So if you have a compare and see how easy it is to move this drive shaft around, and how, you know, there's very, very little play. There's basically no play in there whatsoever. And then you compare it to this one, which has quite a bit of play. See if I can show you. Yeah, see, you can see that little bit of play there, and then when you try and get it past that, it just doesn't go. It just doesn't want to do it at all. So I think what we end up doing is we'll take this part of the drive shaft and use that. We'll probably use the Lotus center shaft here, you know, just in case there's any differences in length. I don't think there's actually any differences. And the other advantage, I know it sounds stupid, but the other advantage is that we can keep the Lotus sticker so it looks OEM. And then what we'll do is we'll just get a second hand, sorry, not a second hand, we'll get an aftermarket outer CV joint that's exactly the same as this Lotus one. Apparently it's from, you know, a Vauxhall or Opel Astra or something like that. You know, Lotus just basically raided the parts bin for that one, and apparently that fits. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a journey, but I think I've just saved myself like $1,000 or something, because these drive shafts are not easy to come by, to be honest, if you want to get a proper Lotus one. So yeah, hopefully that'll save some people some time. Obviously we're going to put in the new grease and the new Tuff Boots on this drive shaft as well, and then once we're done with that, both drive shafts will be ready to go back into the car with new grease, new CV boots. We've checked everything, there's no cracks anywhere, you know. So it's going to be a really good outcome, and definitely something that will make me feel a lot better about the car, especially knowing its history, knowing the fact that it's been, you know, in a bit of an accident on the track. Now I can pretty much sleep easy at night thinking, you know, all of the major mechanical stuff is sorted, and I don't have to worry too much about driving it. Alright, so we're back here a couple of weeks later, and we've taken apart the Toyota drive shaft. What we ended up doing was actually just keeping some of the Toyota drive shaft and then using some of the parts that we had before, as well as getting a brand new outer CV joint, because our outer CV joint was also in bad condition, and it was not moving very freely at all. So this is an aftermarket CV outer CV joint from Elise Parts, and this is the inner CV and the housing from the Toyota drive shaft. So we know that this one's good because it was moving very freely, it was really nice, and it was quite clean, the boots were fine. And then we've got the actual drive shaft from the Exige. So this is the original one. It's got a little bit of damage from the accident. You can see where, you know, the race or whatever it was on there, or the CV joint has actually pushed into the drive shaft, but that should be okay. I don't think there's any real big problems there. It's the same sort of story on the other side as well, but it's very superficial damage, so it should be okay. And in normal conditions, the CV joint will not go up to that point in the drive shaft anyway, so I think that should be okay. And we couldn't use the Toyota version of this because the outer CV is different, the splines are different, so that's one thing that I thought we could use, but we can't, so we have to reuse the one off the Exige, which is fine. So the other thing we have is the CV2 grease, along with our grease gun all set up and ready to go. We've got some new BOE Tuff Boots and clamps, and also we have a new circlip as well if we need it. Hopefully we don't. So now it's just ready for a reassembly, which is pretty straightforward. Yeah, we'll just show you how that all looks once it's all reassembled. Cool, we're just packing some grease into the outer CV joint. Make sure that you cover all the bearings and try and get as much grease in there as possible. Even though it's going to sling around when you're driving around, it's probably best to try and protect it as much as you can before you put it all together. Alright, so what we did was we slid the boot from this end of the drive shaft over to here, and we've filled up this boot with some more grease just to make sure that there's plenty in there, and then the clamp, what we did last time, it actually worked really well, was actually to put the clamp on first and then wiggle it onto the housing together with the boot, so that everything goes on together, because when you try and get this on later, it's very hard. So that's probably a good tip for you. Make sure it's nice and tight. So we've actually adjusted it a little bit so it's a little bit tighter, and then just kind of put it all together and slide it on together as one.
Squeeze!
Nice. Lovely. Good to have tools. Alright, so you might notice that I've painted the aftermarket outer CV joint. You don't have to do that. I just did it just because I don't really want any corrosion on there. Didn't do a very good job because I actually have a bit of a run there, so whoops, it's a bit of a shame, but never mind. It's probably never going to be seen again anyway. So just feed it through, you know, feed it through where it's supposed to go. I've moved my upright out of the way. I've got the brake out of the way as well, the rear brake caliper. So everything's out of the way, and then just feed it through, and make sure that you line up the support over there as well. I'm just going to get under the car and feed it into the gearbox from here. Alright, so my drive shaft is now in. Make sure that when you put the drive shaft back in through the gearbox, that everything lines up okay. Try not to damage the seal around the gearbox as well, around the splines. Make sure there's no debris or anything on the splines, because everything that goes in there will, you know, can potentially go into the gearbox. So just make sure it's all nice and clean, that nothing's on there to abrase or abuse the seal. And then now we just need to do up these two bolts on here. So the good news is it looks like the Toyota shaft, this part of the drive shaft, actually works all the way through the gearbox, which is great. So yeah, we just need to do up these bolts and then tighten up everything on this side as well, and then it should be all good. Need to do the same thing on the other side. The other side has a circlip, but apart from that, it's pretty much the same thing. So a good idea is to use some blue Loctite on these center bearing support bolts, just so that they don't rattle loose. And I've been told that the torque setting is 45 Newton meters for these. So I've got my torque wrench out set to 45, and I'll be tightening those up. So yeah, do the same. Cool, so now we've got the drive shafts on both sides into the gearbox, which is great. I'm very happy about that. We've got the Tuff Boots and the CV2 grease in there as well. And I've tightened up all the bolts that relate to the drive shaft. I've got the brakes off at the moment on the rear, because I'm actually going to be changing the brake pads on the rear as well to Ferodo DS 2500s. So that should be quite good. So basically I'll just go through some of the bolts that you have to do up and the torque settings. So for these ball joint bolts, there's two. There's one here and then one on the other side as well. Those are 55 Newton meters, and for the two bolts at the back of the upright there, that's 68 Newton meters for this car. So just make sure that you torque up the bolts properly, otherwise they may come loose. And then I'll have to torque up the hub nut a little bit later on. I've got new hub nuts on both sides, and new split pins to go in there as well, but I haven't quite torqued that up yet. I've also got some new brake disc retaining bolts. Some of mine were like really bad. They were in really bad condition, so make sure you get some of those as well if you're taking off the brake discs. It's useful to have new bolts in there just in case they seize up, or you know, you can't really get them out, then you have to destroy them to get them out. Awesome, so what are you going to need to fill up the diff fluid now that we've got the drive shafts back in? I've got 3 bottles of MT90, Redline MT90. That is the recommended fluid online that everyone uses. Apparently it is going to help with the gear shifts, especially when it's cold, because I did notice that my gearbox getting into second and third is a little bit tricky when it's cold. And you're going to need a little pump bottle just to pump all the fluid into the gearbox. Cool, so let's do that now. Alright, just fill up your pump bottle. You are going to have to do this a few times because apparently the gearbox takes about 2.7 litres of fluid, so you should probably have to use all 3 bottles. Right, so we're under the car again, and as you can see here is the drain plug, which I've already tightened up, so hopefully there's no leaks coming out of that. And the fill plug is just above that. I think it's a 17mm plug. So this should already be loose because when you drain the fluid you should have loosened this one. Mine's already finger tight, so I can just undo it like this, and that's where we're going to be filling up the fluid from. Basically just fill it up until it runs out of the hole, and then it's full, and then you just put the drain plug, and then you just put the fill plug back in. So yeah, just use that hole there and pump all the fluid in. Alright, so we've pumped enough just so that the fluid starts dripping out, and that's exactly when you need to stop, because otherwise it's just going to all come out anyway. And then we're just going to put the full plug back on, tighten everything up, and it should be good to go. Thanks, George! Right, one final step to get everything tightened up is just to use a torque wrench for your hub nut. So I've got a 30mm impact socket, and I've used the impact gun on it as much as I really want to. And now I'm just going to use my torque wrench, and the correct torque figure is 220 Newton meters. I'm going to get it up to about 200, and then there's a split pin to hold it in place anyway, so we're going to be putting the split pin on after we torque it up properly. I'm going to be doing it in stages, so I've started off with 112 Newton meters, and I'm going to work my way up to 200 just to see how it feels and make sure that everything's okay. Alright, there we go, the split pins are installed as well, and the hub nuts are torqued up, so now it's ready for the wheels to go back on. Alright guys, so that is it in terms of the drive shafts installed back into the car, the Tuff Boots, the CV2 grease, and also the gearbox fluid as well. It was a little bit longer process than expected because we found a bit of damage from the accident, but luckily I was able to salvage the drive shaft by using a Toyota drive shaft plus the aftermarket outer CV joint from Elise Parts. So yeah, that's a good little trick for you guys. If anyone needs a new drive shaft, then perhaps you don't need to buy one from Lotus. You can actually just find one and put one together. I call it the Frankenstein drive shaft or the Frankenshaft, but I guess that's kind of what Lotus did originally anyway, so it makes sense. So thanks for watching this one. It's been a little bit of a long one and a little bit of a up and down journey. Hopefully you learned a lot from this as well, because we certainly did. So yeah, we'll see you next time. Say goodbye to the Exige. Hopefully it'll be back on the road soon.